Yeah.
All right, are you guys good to start letting folks in?
Let's do it. Hello, everyone. There we go. I always get called out by the recording in progress voice, but she has beaten me once again. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Really, really appreciate it. My name's Omar. Excuse me. We are the Akkad household is suffering from what we know for a fact is not COVID, but nonetheless does not make it any more pleasant. My name's Omar. I'm the writer in residence this semester at Queen's University, which rests on the lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. It is a tremendous pleasure to be here with you all for what is the last of these incredibly ad hoc conversations with writers who are far more talented than I am. This one is carrying it solo this time. Usually it's conversations with two writers, and this man's personality and achievements are so outsized. Also, he's the only one who said yes. So that's what we're doing today. It's such a pleasure to welcome Queen's grad and soon to be a best-selling memoirist, ELAMIN ABDELMAHMOUD. He was on several podcasts, but I've been informed that that's been narrowed down to one now, the Pop Chat podcast. You can see him on CBC and virtually every time I come to Canada. It used to be hockey was the first thing I'd see when I turned on television, and now it's ELAMIN. I'm being deliberately flippant because I'm very jealous of his achievements. He has done more in a very short amount of time than I have ever accomplished. His new memoir, his debut book, just got a starred review in Publishers Weekly, which is not an easy thing to do. It was described as enthralling, hilarious, deeply original, and I concur with all of these things. It's the first time I've read a memoir that felt like somebody had taken my early experiences coming to this country and changed the specific details and kept all of the emotions and all of everything else intact. It's an exceptional piece of work. It's called Son of Elsewhere. And I am so pleased to be here with ELAMIN. We'll chat for a while, but during that time, if you have any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat, and I will get to them either in a haphazard manner or at the end. First of all, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm fine. Listen, Omar, that was an alarmingly generous introduction. You did too much, and I'm proud to say that between the two of us, we have one Giller Prize, which is pretty incredible.
Oh, no, I pawned it already, buddy. That's gone.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for risking your reputation to endorse a book that these folks haven't read. Like, I don't know, maybe they'll say, man, I don't know if I trust that Omar's judgment after this. So who's to say what's going to come of that? But also, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be the only one who said yes. Whoever didn't say yes, they're really missing out.
Where are you right now? Are you in Toronto?
I'm in Toronto. I'm in this strange bedroom that doesn't know what it wants to be. We just moved and we haven't figured out what this bedroom is going to be. At a certain point we will, but right now it's like a bedroom that has this backdrop, and that's why I use it for these things.
You have a young child, right?
I do. I have a 5-year-old. She turns 5 in a month or so.
Oh, very cool. Our kids are almost exactly the same age. Anyone who has young kids, I have my tolerance for their Zoom backgrounds is just through the roof. Like, it could be just a raging fire behind you, and I'd just be like, he found space. He found a place to Zoom from. So, okay, before I get to all of the questions that I want to ask you and make this more relevant to the Queen's connection, I just want to start with what your life's like right now I've only done this twice in my life, but you've got a book coming out. And so there's, I assume, a whole bunch of pre-publicity stuff and just like weird logistical things, in addition to this being a pandemic and having to sort of deal with all that. What is your life like in the early stages of putting a book out into the world? What's going on with you right now?
Emotional turmoil, I think, is the best way to describe it. I had to sort of approve the final pages like literally today. Like after this is it. I can't change a thing. And I have a mind to call our friend Jared and be like, you know what, cancel the whole thing. I think we're good. We don't need to put this out. So I think that's like the main dimension of what I'm dealing with. I think there's another element of it that is, we're dealing with like maybe an excerpt that's going to go somewhere out there in the world. And there's a lot of conversations about like how long that excerpt should be. It's from a chapter that is 11,000 words. And as it turns out, I'm a little bit precious about all those 11,000 words. I didn't know this until I saw, like a 4,800 word cut. I'm like, no, but like you're missing all the good stuff because I believe in the rest of it too. And also like the publisher was like, actually, like that's already too many words that we're running. And so like, these are conversations that I'm deeply unfamiliar with. I went through several stages of grief for saying, okay, I'm not going to get any kind of physical book tour because of Omicron, but now it looks like the world is reopening and maybe I will. And so I had to sort of like prepare myself for that not to happen. And now I'm preparing myself for that to happen. It's been a journey. I don't recommend to anyone else writing a book during a pandemic. It was not my plan, certainly, but we're here now.
Before I ask you about the book, rather than me butcher it with a description of my own based on my reading, you want to give these folks a sense of what ground this memoir covers?
Sure, I'd love to. So I moved to Canada when I was 12, and when I moved to Canada, my dad had already been here for 4 years before that, and in his infinite wisdom, he picked out of all towns, a town that you're all familiar with, which is Kingston, Ontario. It's not a usual pick for an immigrant to settle down as a town. You could have picked Toronto. In fact, initially he did, and then he decided a few months after saying, you know what, Toronto's too much. I'm going to go to a place like Kingston, a place where I came here, and for me having no reference points for people who look like me, there's just not that many of them. I started to just like figure out this whole Canada business. I had to figure it out while also learning English and learning the customs and traditions. And also I have a new identity now after having arrived in Canada. I'm suddenly Black, and I wasn't Black for my whole life before I came here. And so it's working through all of those things, because what happens to me anyway, when I land in a place like Kingston at the age of 12 and I don't speak English, is I spend maybe a decade of my life painfully trying to make people not think about the fact that I'm an immigrant, not think about the fact that I'm Muslim, not think about the fact that I'm Black. And after a decade of doing so, suddenly you kind of realize that all these identities that you try to pretend you're not, you kind of carry them along with you the whole time. They've been sort of your companions the whole time. And so the book was kind of born out of me asking, what are those identities owed? Like, what do I owe those parts of me that I sort of like spent such a long time putting in a cage and be like, I don't need you right now. I don't need to think about the fact that I'm Muslim. I don't need to think about the fact that I'm Black. And then working backwards, working through why I felt the need to do that, and what is owed to those identities now. But it's all filtered through the pop culture that I was consuming at the time, whether it's wrestling, because I moved to Kingston, where lots of folks in my school were like, wrestling is like the thing that's going to make you belong. It's not, by the way. Or like shows like the OC and their relationship to me learning to fall in love in English, a language that is not entirely my own. Those are the broad strokes of what the book is about.
I mean, one of the things about, you bring up the wrestling thing, that the chapter on finding a sense of community through wrestling fan fiction, I guess is the way to. I remember when I was in Qatar and we got the internet I was, it was sort of mid 90s. And somebody said, I was like, you got to go to XFiles.com. I was like, all right. It's like, yeah, there's a chat there. You can chat with other, you type stuff and it shows up on the screen and they can see it and then they can type. And I spent years of my life on the X-Files chat forum. Like I made friends. And thing is, I've never seen an episode of the X-Files. Like I'm aware of what it is just through cultural osmosis. I've never in my life seen it. But it was a huge part of my social existence and being able to sort of reach the other side of the planet.
Did your screen name have to do? Were you like Mulder 25? Like what did you do?
So there was no. We never talked about the X-Files. I can't stress this enough. Like there was never any. I didn't learn a thing about. But if you chatted enough, your rank went up. So you started out as agent, and then you became like secret agent or special, and then you became director. None of this is relevant to anything. It just I'm thinking of like when I read that chapter and just being like, yeah, it's bizarre where you find these little communities.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'm always curious what it's like when you sort of attack this culture head on at different ages. So I started learning English at 5, and I imagine that's an entirely different sort of relationship with the language and the culture that's being sort of brought in via that language than at 12.
Mm-hmm.
And I am wondering sort of, did you come in carrying anything culturally, or was it a great distance between this part of the world when you were on the other side of the planet and then showing up here? Like, did you have any kind of relationship with the culture beforehand, or was it sort of a blank slate at 12?
Did you ever read, when you were growing up, did you ever read the Adham Sabri books?
No.
So Dr. Nabil Farouk, who's an Egyptian writer, has this like series of basically like little adventure books. And their main character, Adham Sabri, is sort of like an Egyptian James Bond. And his job is to go and travel the world and try to sort of outdo other intelligence services. Like the CIA would be there, and Mossad would be there, the KGB would be there. But no, it was always Adham Sabri who got the information first, or got the microchip first, or beat up everybody, every one of the bad guys. I really think that was foundational to me in my understanding of the West. And I really didn't have much of a distinction between America and Canada. I was Canada looks like it's just the top part of America. And so for me, I was I'm going to the imperialist house. That's where I'm going. And also I don't speak English. And so for me, when I was learning the language, I had, it was almost like a protective relationship to it. It was learned out of a desperation to be I got to shield myself around these people, and I got to make sure that they don't think that I'm different than them. I got to sort of figure out a way to shield myself from whatever is about to come. And so even my attempts to acquire the culture were in a sort of a defensive posture. It was let me just blend in so no one thinks anything bad is going to happen, because I've read in those books that they don't like people like me. They don't, and if Adham Sabri gets the microchips, there's gonna be hell to pay for all of Egypt and all the Arab world. So that was sort of my understanding of what this culture is about. That's unfortunately, it was one of the most foundational texts of my life.
It's weird because you bring that up, and my reference point is another Egyptian secret agent, a guy named Fatah Gen, which was a TV series that is essentially exactly the plot you just described. I think at one point in Egypt, 80% of the cultural output was just Egyptian secret agent fantasies about outwitting the imperialists or whatever.
Yeah.
So okay, so you get to Kingston at 12. Talk to me about Queens. How you ended up there, how you ended up going there, what your first sort of experience of Queens was.
It was bitter, and it was bitter because I wanted to go to Carleton University. That was my number one goal. That was the thing I wanted most in the world, is Carleton University. And so I didn't think that I would get into any university. So I applied to 9 of them, which I learned later is excessive and not a thing that you should do. And my number one was Carleton, not just because of the beautiful red brick buildings in Ottawa, but also because at the time I wanted to go to law school. That was the plan. And Carleton has an undergrad in law, and I was perfect. I'll take an undergrad in law. I'll be the most prepared person for law school there ever has been in the history of law school. And then my parents said no. My parents said, actually, you're not going to do that. You're going to go to Queens and you're going to live at home. And I said, but I'm a person and I have agency. And they said, no, you don't. You're going to go to Queens, and like this is going to be the thing that happens. And so when I first got to Queens, it was like with a lot of resistance. It was a lot of like, I don't want to do this, and this is really not my dream. That was relationship number one. But relationship number two was that it was the most diverse place I'd ever been to. And I'm saying this because I traveled all the way from the west end of Kingston, Bay Ridge Secondary to be specific, to downtown. Like my world suddenly was like, oh, wait a minute, what is going on here? There's all kinds of people that don't exist, just like in the west end of the city. I arrived in 2000, and then I started university in 2005. And I guess it must have been the case that in those 5 years, I just never went to campus for any reason whatsoever. Because when Queens sort of happened to me, I was in the midst of my own culture shock of saying, this is the most diverse place I've ever seen. And it's merely 25-minute bus ride on the number 6 bus from the suburbs to downtown. And then I get to campus and there's all these conversations happening about the diversity of campus. So this is 2005. This is immediately after the Henry Report, talking about the lack of diversity in curriculum, but also in faculty. And this is immediately post a blackface incident with Miss Ethiopia that went sort of viral on Facebook in the very early days of Facebook, when universities were just getting Facebook. So I suddenly found myself in this diverse utopia, and everyone around me is like, it's not diverse enough, and also, by the way, it's racist. And I'm like, what? Am I missing like a lot? I feel like I'm missing a part of the textbook here. And so there commences my education, and it's like literally through the zines that are handed to you during Frost Week, one of them being called Culture Shock, that I first encounter the ideas of folks who are saying, yeah, like this place can offer us a lot, but also here's how we are going to think about ourselves with regards to race, because like on this campus, we are minorities because we come from a different place. We come from a Scarborough, or we come from a Mississauga, or a Brampton, where we're very familiar with what it's like for us to be reasonably represented, and we're not represented here. And so I sort of had to like integrate everything I knew about my life in Kingston with like this sudden new reality.
I mean, that genuinely, like, no offense to my alma mater, but that's a genuinely amazing sentence, right? To say,
I recognize that.
Place I've ever been like that is,
yeah,
that's something.
Yeah. Yes.
So
talk to my dad about that. He chose Kingston, man. We have a lot of conversations about that's a very specific choice. It's great.
But I mean, that's the thing, right? Like you talk about this idea of your parents saying like, nope, not Carleton. And I can see people sort of interpreting that in a certain way, but like for me, it's the most natural, like that was the most natural sounding thing, right? Like the generation of parents who came over here from the other side of the planet, like, the root system, you're in the middle of digging it as all of this is happening. And you're not learning the culture at 12, you're not learning the culture at 5. How much of writing the book sort of necessitated interrogating that and talking to your parents about a sort of the emotional and psychological underpinnings of being that way relative to your life, but also whether that's changed over the years since they've been here?
So one of the challenges for me has been trying to figure out where the book should end, because it really doesn't go much further past, like, I would say, like 2012, 2013 or so. There's a few sort of stories from after that, but like it really covers from arrival until about 2012. And I would say like the reason it stops there is because that was the journey of that was a period of time with the most intense transformation of how I thought about them as figures in my life. I found it really easy through, the angsty world of wrestling, but also the angsty world of the metal music that I was attracted to at first, to have actually like a really antagonistic relationship with them, to view it as specifically a relationship about control and about nothing else. And then so much of writing this book was about going back and, you know, recontextualizing and maybe healing certain moments of them acting out of a certain way and saying, oh, this was never about control. This was about fear. This was about sort of like trying to exert as much, as much control as possible over an environment where you feel it is chaotic and you don't really know what to expect. And so, you know, them saying, look, man, you got to come home by like 7 p.m. And if you're home at 7:30, where there's going to be a fight, is like, it's to them, like they literally just don't know what happens in Canadian people's homes, like in white people's homes. They're like, we don't know what that's like. If this was Sudan, we'd never be worried about you. But we just don't know what that's like. And because we don't know what that's like, we're going to sort of hold on to this idea that like, we got to protect you. And then I really sort of spend a lot of time, maybe too much time in the book, returning to those feelings of, well, my parents don't understand me, and hopefully that pays off at the end, when I say that like we've figured out a way to move towards each other. We figured out a way to sort of express a language of love that has to do with what I learned here, them understanding that like they moved me here when I was 12, and that's of course going to inevitably shape me, and me sort of relearning everything that has happened to me through the lens of their worst fears and how that made them sort of act. I tried to make it, you know, as compassionate as possible, because I do think that like for us, our relationship has really benefited from that recontextualization. Having said that, like, you know, they're gonna read some stories and be like, oh yeah, we did do that. That's hard to read. That's hard to, you know, revisit. And one of the conversations that I had with my editor was like, look, even with the stories that I'm able to go into here, there's definitely two versions of this book. And one of them is not the book I can write when they're alive, because it's like about being as truthful as possible to the pain that I felt from this tension, while also feeling very protective of them, and trying to balance the two of them.
I'm curious about the, you know, I was thinking a while back about, there's a lot of the stuff that shows up in the book. I'm like, yeah, the details are different, but this happened. I remember this, I remember that.
Yeah.
And this idea of sort of, I remember thinking about how I was going to make damn sure that this gap that through nobody's fault, really, I have between me and my parents, just culturally and sort of, you know, they marinated in one place.
Yeah.
They didn't leave Egypt when they were 5 years old. I did. And making sure that that wasn't going to be the case one generation down. And of course, watching it in real time now happen, because my daughter's not going to live on the other side of the planet until she's 60 and come here. And sort of, I'm wondering how much of your experiences now starting the other half of that journey have sort of recontextualized how you feel about the previous half.
Well, at least when it comes to parenting, I find myself engaging in incredibly avoidant behavior, which is to say, like, just trying as much as possible to say, I should deal with this at some point, right? I should sort of spend the time introducing to Amna that there is a complexity. My daughter's name is Amna, and introducing the complexity of her background to her. But I keep just something catching. I haven't quite gone around to it in a way that I think is meaningful. We've introduced this framework where I'm like, okay, like every weekend we're gonna do Baba School, and Baba School is gonna be a combination of teaching you about the history of Sudan, and also like a little bit of Arabic, but also she's 5 and I wake up and I'm like, yeah, like I would like to sleep in today, you know, or I wake up and we're like, there's other things to tend to. And so even though in her mind, like she understands that there's a thing called Baba School, I don't think it's actually like ever actually happened. And instead, like she's exposed to it in really heightened moments. So like during Eid, for example, we'll be like, it's Eid. And she's like, that's when I get a lot of presents. I'm like, yeah, but it's more than that. She's like, no, it's not. It's when I get a lot of presents. And I keep constantly wondering whether I've missed the boat. she's 5. Like that's how early the anxiety sets in. I keep wondering if I've missed the boat to sort of introduce her to this world in a way that will make that gap make sense for her, while also not doing anything about it, which is a really great place to be in. Highly recommend.
The other day I was asking my daughter, I wanted to make sure she knew what Ramadan was coming out. She's like, of course I know. It's when boys don't eat when it's sunny out. I mean, she knows one boy. He lives in the house and he doesn't eat when it's sunny out for some reason. And I was like, you know what? Close enough.
Good enough. Yeah. I mean, there's an indignity to this, right? Like there's truly an indignity in this, because you're like, there is like a rich world that I'd like to communicate to you. But you're 5, and like there's only so much you can expect from that. And so I'm trying to figure out like the smallest ask possible. That's like, yeah, we're going to count this as a victory for now. And then a little bit later, we'll figure out what another victory is. I think my bar is too low. My parents often remind me that my bar is too low, but I'm like, this is what I have capacity for, man. Like, let's revisit this when she's 8.
But also, I mean, I'd imagine the sort of the lack of an institutional support mechanism. Like, I was a kid, I was like 5 or 6 or something, and I got gum stuck in my hair. We were driving around. I don't know how I did this, how I managed to do this. But my dad was just like, oh, fine. And he pulled over at the nearest mosque. And it was like, I don't know, it was late at night. And there was never any thought that like, oh, I wonder if the door's going to be unlocked or whatever. It was understood that this was the Commons. And if this one, for some reason, like there's one down the street, and sort of there was like a kind of institutional underpinning that was doing so much of the heavy lifting that when you live on the other side of the planet, suddenly you're that being, right? Like so much of, and I don't know how to get around that, right? Like you wrote this incredible essay, which I'm not going to go too much into, but I bring it up every time we talk because it was really moving to me. And I urge you all to look it up. It's about names, I guess, for lack of a better descriptor. But I remember thinking about that. My daughter's name is Dahlia. We sat down when she was on her way here. We sat down and thought, okay, what names are going to work in both cultures, right? Like what names? And we settled on this, and it's a beautiful name. It's the name of a flower, and sort of the end result now is that my wife's family in southwestern Ontario mispronounced the name one way, and my Arab family mispronounced the name an entirely different way, because in Arabic it's Delia, and they send in southwestern Ontario they all say Dahlia, and so it's now mispronounced 2 separate ways, which is like the exact opposite of the whole endeavor going into it. But these are things you think about, and these are things that, I mean, like you literally think about quite deeply in your writing. Are you in any way sort of afraid of this thing that when you were writing it belonged exclusively to you, and you could make overlap directly with your intent now about, on the verge of belonging to everybody but you and being understood in all these different ways? Is there trepidation about that? How do you feel about that handover?
Well, now there is. I think there wasn't before, but thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. Yeah, I think there's an element of the story sort of losing its context. You know what I mean? And that's the thing that I think worry about the most. I worry that someone will read this and be like, yeah, see, immigrant parents are difficult. I'm like, no, like it's like, that's not what I was trying to get across. There is, I think, the sensitivity you have to the fact that everybody will sort of engage with the work from where they're standing, and hopefully they can find a place where they can relate to it from. But I think like thinking for me personally about the works that I've like really internalized, that I was like, oh, I'm not sure this was meant for me to internalize this deeply, but like something about it resonated really deeply. I would just make sure that I never talk about it with the author. And so thanks a lot, man. Really appreciate this.
You have no idea what you're in for, do you?
Not at all.
Not at all. Before the book launches, I'm going to give you access to my inbox. And get a taste of what's going to happen. As you all can tell, I could do this all day, but I'll give you the half-hour reminder again if you want. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we will put my guest on the spot. Good. I was going to type them under different names. Just you need practice, right? Like this is
camp. This is training. grounds.
You know,
Nice.
one of the greatest things I did for my career, you know, my 2-novel career as a writer, and I didn't know I was doing it at the time, but ahead while I was writing American War, my first novel, I was in Portland. I didn't know anybody. We just moved, and my friend was like, "Hey, I know this guy who teaches a stand-up comedy class. You should go." And I was like, "Okay, that sounds bizarre, but sure." He's like, "Yeah, you'll make friends and stuff." So I go, and it was useless. I mean, the guy up front was like, "I can't make you funny. Like that's not what's happening here." He was a working comedian, and so he was very much on the technical. Like he was like, "Don't ever run the light. Make sure when the red light comes on, when you see it in the back, don't go over. They'll never invite you to that club again. Make sure you have a solid 5. Know your go-to bits." And like clearly, I have no career in like that's never going to happen. But like the stuff on a technical level has been useful in every literary festival I've ever gone to. Like all
That's
of that.
amazing.
Stuff. So yeah, just like heads up, like you being remotely on time to stuff, or just not just like inciting a riot based on stuff you say. Like the threshold for writers is so low at public events to just do the bare minimum. Anyway,
This is really reassuring. I more of this, please.
You're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. I want to go back to Queens. One of the questions I've been asking the writers that I've had on this series is what in hindsight was surprising for you about either a class you took that has, you know, hugely influenced you that maybe you didn't think would do that, or a club you joined, or something that sort of like the trajectory was going this way and then this happened and it sort of took a turn.
I love that question. I would say that for me in my final year, or what was supposed to be my final year, which was the year 2009, I was a philosophy graduate, and like that was the plan. The plan was, okay, can't go to Carleton. What's the next best thing? We're going to study philosophy, and we're going to study it at Queen's University. And it was going, I would say, fine. I would not say that I had a stellar philosophy career, not at all. In my third year, I wrote a paper for Professor Laycock, which was about the difference between stuff and things, which is not an entirely compelling thing to me now. But I would say like I did well, and I got this paper. And I was like, I'm not sure that I'm learning anything. I feel like I'm really good at going through the motions of this, but I'm not sure that I'm taking in enough information right now. But at the same time, I had a few extra credits to get, all electives. Let's figure out what we can fill the space with. And I settled on a third-year gender studies class called Islam and Feminism, taught by Dr. Dana Olwan. And that was a class that I chose because I was like, well, I know Islam. This is gonna be great. And I got in, and it was the most incredible class. It was sort of introducing me to a lot of post-colonial theories I'd never thought about, radical feminist writing that I'd never thought about before, recontextualizing a lot of social and political philosophy that I maybe read in other places in my philosophy degree, but hadn't engaged with it in this different light. And I got literally like 2 weeks into the class, I was like, I would like a degree that means something. So I will go and drop my philosophy degree in my fourth year, go drop my philosophy degree, and opt to do a gender studies degree. And like, I sort of did the math, and it turned out that, you know, just based on the classes I'd taken that were kind of maybe in politics or in philosophy, I could get away with doing all of the required courses for a gender studies degree in about another year and a half. And so I was literally taking like gender studies first year classes at the same time as taking fourth year classes, which was not recommended, I would say. Like, just the streams are designed that way for a reason. You should generally follow the reason that they're designed for. But it was genuinely a turning point for me, just in terms of understanding how my classes can matter in a way that I hadn't thought about before. And like, I haven't thought about the difference between stuff and things since. So that's merciful, you know? I don't know what the difference between stuff and things is now anymore.
Well, I mean, that's subject of book number 2, I feel.
Imagine. Yeah.
So you take this sort of hard right turn very late in the collegiate career. What is it like to sort of step outside of the Queen's bubble, get out on the other side of university. And, like my degree's in computer science, but I can't do anything in computer science. Like I did not deserve that degree. They should take it back. There was never any way that like I was going to go work for Google the day I left Queens. That was never, ever happening. There was the thing I wanted to do. And, I wanted to write, I wanted to be a journalist. But had that not worked out, there was no safety net. It was just free fall into like whatever, I don't know. When you first leave Queens, talk to me a little bit about the sort of gap between that moment of exiting this, relatively sheltered place in terms of there being structure and stuff, and where you are now, which is like incredibly well established and like a cultural medium on a national level, soon to be an international level, as books getting published in the US as well. How scary is that gap? What do you do there? Do you ever feel like there's no sort of safety net?
Well, no, but it's because I had a plan, but this was never the plan. So like, it's like the safety of having a plan immediately afterwards. People would be like, what are you going to do with a gender studies degree? And I would say, I don't know either. And so the initial step after Queens was to go in a direction of, I want to go to public policy school. And I apply to a bunch of public policy schools and they all say, no, thank you. Like they all very politely, say like, appreciate your application, but you're not the guy for us. In retrospect, that's a mercy. I'm very grateful for that because I don't think I actually have the brain for the minutia that is required in public policy school. That is just not how I'm naturally wired, but I just thought that might be like a place to go after university. What I did have was experience at CFRC, the radio station, and experience at the Journal. Those were the two things that I did do at Queens. I think in retrospect, I'm an idiot because I'm like, yeah, that's what I spent my time wanting to do is sort of think about the immediate environment that I'm in and writing about it or talking about it. I was news director for CFRC. I was a columnist for the Journal. And so immediately after graduating and coming to Toronto, I was a bit adrift. I was like, I don't really know what I'm going to do. I'm going to wait for these public policy schools to get back to me. And then they all very quickly were like, no. And I was like, no, I have an apartment now in Toronto. What am I going to do? And the only thing I could do was I was attending some tapings of the George Stroumboulopoulos Tonight Show, which this was back in like 2011 or so. And there was a woman sitting in a chair in the corner who was like, she was just pointing at everyone and telling them what to do. Like she's sort of like an air traffic controller for the whole place. And just kind of on a whim, I was like, hey, are you hiring? And she was like, no, who the hell are you? But she made the mistake of giving me her business card. And she was the executive producer of the show. And she was like, I'm not hiring right now, but like check back later. Your girl got an email from me every 3 weeks. I mean, it was like, hey, I'm around. Hey, just wondering if you're hiring because I'm still around and I still don't have a job, which was not true. I worked at the Apple store for about 8 weeks. And then they were like, this is not working out. And I was like, this is not working out. And yeah, I went to George Stroumboulopoulos Tonight on a 30-day contract. That was sort of the start of this whole media career. And then at the end of the season, which was in June, they were like, okay, everyone, the season's done. Maybe see you guys back in September if we choose to take you on for the next season. And I sort of tried the argument that the season's done on my landlord, but he was like, no, like rent doesn't have seasons. And I ended up in news, but I didn't end up in news because I was drawn to news initially. I ended up in news because news doesn't have seasons. Like it was like completely a function of necessity. And from there on, I think like my gender studies education was really helpful in, just contextualizing larger stories. So a thing that is happening that maybe there's a story about like a very specific, I don't know, like a specific geopolitical story, you could then sort of give the larger, wider implications of it because you have that education. Like that's what a humanities education ultimately is good for. But that wasn't, that wasn't the thing that I was going to be able to do. The job that I got in news was editorial assistant at the National. And it's a wonderful title that in effect means I have to run around with a lot of copies of the script to everybody who needs it. But my first job where I could use the education that I had was with The Agenda, which is a show at TVO and hosted by Steve Bacon. And that's a show that's like, okay, this news story happened. Let's talk about the 10,000 foot implications of it. And I was like, I could do that. That's the thing I'd like to do. And I spent a bit of time with The Agenda and then on to sort of BuzzFeed, which is where I've been for the last 6.5 years or so. That's like a line by line sort of rundown of the resume of how we kind of got here. But I think overall, I've had the ability, I think largely because of that gender studies education, to go to like any manager that I have and be like, hey, can I just write or talk a little bit about the wider implications of this? And in the first few years, they'd be like, no, who are you? And then eventually I had a manager who was like, I guess, try it. And she made that mistake because this whole career is her fault. And so now we're here.
I mean, it's amazing how often that works out in people's stories.
Yes.
It's like, what do you mean? What was the plan? Was that this was the open slot? And so it's just like, at the Globe, when I showed up as an intern the year I graduated from Queens, the only position they had was a last-minute parental leave.
Mm-hmm.
The investment reporter at ROB decided to split his parental leave with his wife, who was also working at ROB. Mm-hmm. And so they needed a fill-in investment reporter for the summer. And I showed up with $4 change in my checking account. And I'm sure there's people who were led to financial ruin in the summer of 2005 because they followed the advice of a 22-year-old on which stocks to invest in. It was ludicrous, right? But you're like, this is it, you know?
Yeah. There's just like a weird romance of like, you know, telling the story backwards always makes it seem so intentional. Like, did this, then did this, and then this led to this. And it's like, no, when you're in the middle of it, it's all chaos. It's like, I have no idea where this is going. And this thing popped up. And then I was like, sure, that sounds like a fun thing to try. Or, oh, I got to pay the rent and this show is not around for 2 months. I got to figure out some alternative of how to, you know, continue to pay rent. So there's a lot more sort of, you know, providence or accident in terms of getting to the final destination.
Yeah, I mean, it's the metaphor I always go back to is like that Japanese game show where there's a foam board coming towards the contestant and there's a cutout in a certain shape and you have to contort yourself into that shape to not get knocked over. Like that's entirety of the early part of the career is like investment reporter cutout, time to contort into that. Yeah. I spent a lot of this morning trying. I love that somebody knows what that game show is.
That's amazing. And I'm going to YouTube it. That sounds great.
Yeah, it's like Pringles, like, you know, how you'd like eat 50 of them without noticing. You'll spend like 6 hours watching this thing and you won't know where the time went. I spent a good chunk of the morning trying to think of a segue into country music, like something that's made it sound like it was a reasonable, because I literally for a while where everybody was like, you got to check out ELAMIN. He's like, it's got, and I thought that you that's what you did was write about country music exclusively. I thought that was, and I mean, like, you know, the sort of like flippant question is like, what the hell, man? Like, where do you go from like migrating to Kingston to, but it's actually like the subject of one of the most poignant parts of the book is you talking about what this means. So, I mean, in lieu of a really erudite question, just talk to me a bit about country music.
Oh man, where do you want to start? No, I'm joking. I love country music, but I'm new to country music. I think I would say it's like a recent thing in my life. And if my wife were here, she's downstairs. She can definitely hear this conversation. She would chime in and be like, I didn't sign up for any of this. Like, this was not anything that I signed up for at all. You led me to believe that you were a different kind of person. You listened to different kinds of music than this, but here we are. I would say that country came into my life maybe 6 or 7 years ago when someone was like, hey man, do you know the Byrds? And I was like, no, like the ones in the sky. But like I was sort of listening to the band. And someone said, recommended Sweetheart of the Rodeo, which is a seminal Byrds album. And I listened to it and I was like, there's something happening to me emotionally that reminds me a lot of Sudanese music. And I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is that is like making this music kind of feel a little bit like home. And I spend a little bit more time listening to more country music. I spent a little bit more time listening to Emmylou Harris, listening to Willie Nelson, listening to like the country greats, and finding that there's something magical there that brings me back to my relationship with Sudan, but also my relationship with Sudanese music. And partly it's because like so much of Sudanese music is like about the Nile, you know, and it's about geography, and it's about place. And there isn't an analog for that in sort of Western pop music. Like there's not a lot of pop music that spends its time talking so much about place. Hip hop does a little bit, but for reasons that you will read in the book, like I was initially horrified of hip hop. So it was like sort of also a later introduction into my life. But as you sort of dig deeper and deeper into country, you're like, this is increasingly a place I'd like to spend more time. To the point where every once in a while I get a chance to, you know, write a feature about it, write a long story about it. Last year I got to profile Brandy Carlisle, and after that profile Jason Isbell, who are two musicians that mean a lot to me just in terms of like their music and their work. When I proposed the piece to my editor, I was like, look, you got to send me to Nashville for 3 days. There's this guy named Jason Isbell. You don't understand. I'm going to come back and file a great profile. And I did. I came back and I filed for her 9,500 words. And she said, no, we're not running this. We're an internet website. Are you crazy? And she was appreciative of the fact that like I really cared about all of this. But then we ended up having this like long conversation about how long the piece needed to be. And at first she was like, no more than 4,000 words. Nobody's going to read any of this. We sort of settled somewhere in the middle. It sort of landed around 8,000 or so. And it was the piece. I'd never published a piece where I was more nervous about the numbers. We normally don't care at all about numbers, but I was like, I stuck my neck out for this piece. I said, I gotta go talk to this guy. They sent me to Nashville. They sent a photographer, you know, to photograph everyone who's performing with Jason Isbell. It's 8,000 words long. But it's like, it was like one of our highest, most read pieces of last year. Like that was like really satisfying because I think country music opens the door to a lot of questions about identity, about history, about the way we think about ourselves. That piece specifically was about country music and its relationship to the Black stars in the genre and how it spends a lot of time sort of ruminating on a white version of nostalgia. I'm really proud of that piece. I think you should go read it. It'll take you some time because it's not a short one, but it was like a really satisfying to write.
Yeah, has this served as a cautionary tale for an aspect of your personality? Like, are you always wary of the next thing that might come along and like become an obsession for you culturally out of nowhere? Do you like you stay on the lookout for that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think I'm anxious about a few things. One of them is I'm anxious about the moment that my daughter goes, "What the fuck, Dad?" And I don't know what that's going to be about because I've had that several times with my parents, just in terms of being like, "Whoa, we don't think that way anymore." Okay, and like certainly there's gonna be something about the way that I change in the future where my daughter's going to come to me and be like, "That's incredibly outdated." I think I'm sensitive to that, but I don't know what it's going to be. She's 5. She doesn't have any opinions of the sort yet. She will at a certain point. But then the second element is if country music can kind of come out of nowhere. And I think like for the longest time, I thought I knew what country music was about. And then I was like, I spent more time with it. And I was like, oh yeah, I don't. If country music can kind of come out of nowhere and become such a central facet of my life, I'm like, what else is out there? What is the other thing that I'm missing that I'm not curious enough about now? And also, like, what's going to be the inciting incident that suddenly makes me curious about it? And the answer is, I don't know. I don't know what that could be, but you kind of, I don't know. I think it makes you retain a certain kind of looseness in terms of being able to listen to what that could be, you know?
It occurs to me that we're only 10 minutes from the end, which feels ridiculous.
Oh, no.
I wanted to ask you about, there is a memoir writing class, I believe at Queen's now. There are students in it who are thinking about this form, obviously. Mm-hmm. One of the things, you know, I've talked to a lot of students during this residency that I'm doing here, and I always want to give them all this advice, but really like the the point of asymmetry is not talent. I'm not more talented than any of these students. I'm not a better writer. I've just been on this earth for a longer amount of time. And so, they're in a position where they're writing about their lives, but their lives are half as long as mine.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering sort of if you're giving advice to these students who are thinking about this mode, or even if you're thinking about what advice you would give to a younger you, what comes to mind in terms of how students can think about this form of writing?
Hard question. I guess I would maybe start by saying it took me a long time to learn the difference, me personally, and this doesn't have to be the case for everybody else, but it took me a long time to learn the difference between wanting to write and wanting to have written. Because for a lengthy period of time, I was like, I just want my life to congeal into a clear narrative that I can just sort of distill. But I was cooking and I didn't know that I was cooking, and it took like a long time for all of these ideas to cook the way that they did. And then they did. And then once that sort of becomes clear, I think there's a real sense that I don't buy the idea that it possesses you, but I do buy the idea that it draws you a little bit. It says like, there's more in this direction, keep looking, keep going in that direction. And there's a material difference in how that felt. Like I didn't mean that in like bodily, like in my body, it felt different. The difference between desiring to really like to have written something and saying, okay, now we have enough stuff, like this nebula's gathered enough gravitational force to like become a thing. Like, let's go get it. Let's go figure out what that is. But that took longer than I wanted it to. And that was frustrating in certain parts. Because I spent a long time thinking, no, this is like, I should be writing. I should be writing this thing. And I was just not ready. Personally, I was not ready. And then when I was ready, it's not like that made it easier for it to come forth, but at least I sort of knew the thing that I was pursuing.
You touched on this a little bit at one point, but one of the things that I think about, it's a form that is beyond me. I'm in awe of anyone who can sort of be that vulnerable and that honest on the page. I have to lie repeatedly and lie doubly, like invent a character and have them lie on my behalf. The calculus of how much of yourself you want to give away to the page,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of like thinking about, I'm going to keep this mine. I'm wondering, you mentioned that the idea of this with respect to your parents and your feelings about how your parents behaved, that there's two different books, one of them being only sort of published after they're gone. And was that calculus running throughout the book of thinking about, okay, I can put this on the page and sort of make it someone else's, make it the reader's, versus no, this one's staying home. How much did that sort of influence the process?
I would say that like the second draft was the hardest one, because the first draft was like, this is not a book. This is a Google Doc with a dream. Like it's not, it's like, it wants to be something, but it's not, we're not there yet. And for me, there was no sense of like a deeply imagined audience. But then you kind of get to the second draft and saying, okay, these are thoughts about people that exist in my life, and they're going to maybe at a certain point read them and engage with them. What do I owe them? Well, also, what do I owe myself? The self that is produced this feels true at this moment that I put this down. But then you go through that with every line and with every revelation, I would say. There were things that I didn't want to put in the text that I ended up being convinced to put in the text because they were worth preserving. But my initial instinct was to cut them. But also cut the other way around, that like there were sections I was like, this is overdoing it. And we don't, I don't need to get into this level of details. But like there was there's no philosophy that can sort of guide all this work. It's like a purely on a word by word, line by line basis when you revisit those moments, because some of them can feel good to get out on the page, but I'm like, oh, I needed to get this out, but I didn't need to like expose this to the world. I think that is a different calculus, but an enjoyable one. I think it's sort of like it teaches you a lot about yourself to be like, okay, this is what I'm ready to talk about with these people, and this is what I'm not ready to do.
Before I go on my incredibly rambling epilogue to this event and this series and my residency and public life in general, what are you reading these days? What are you listening to? Give us some cultural recommendations, stuff that's moved you recently.
Oh boy, I'm listening to a lot of I listen because I host a podcast. I also just listen to a lot of podcasts. I'm listening to the Ezra Klein Show, which is like a New York Times produced opinion show. I've been really craving just like deep history and deep context when it comes to like the Russia-Ukraine conflict. A lot of people who are talking about like what's happening now. I'm like, can I just get like a little deeper in terms of like context and history? It's funny that like, it's not funny, but in these moments, like you really feel the craving of history and like the craving of context, because the information overload can be so overwhelming that you're like, no, can we just slow it down just a little bit? In terms of what I'm reading, let me tell you, okay, this is gonna be great. The two books on my desk at the moment are this wonderful book by Safi Al-Hillel. It's called Home is Not a Country. It's a novel in verse. It's so beautiful. She's a Sudanese writer who's based in the US, and she's written a deeply, deeply moving meditation on what it's like to think about a home that you've never been to, and highly recommend. But then the other book is this one, which is called Where the Devil Don't Stay. And it's a book about Jason Isbell's old band, the Drive-By Truckers, and how they sort of like deeply influenced how we think about modern music and how specifically modern country music, because these were guys who, you know, no one wanted to put them on. They would go and play like all over the South. And as they would sort of show up, they would see like a Confederate flag and be like, you're missing the point. Get the hell out of our show. Like it was sort of like a lot of battling the nostalgia of country music and country rock music as they're performing that music. You know, these are people who like worship the folks of Lynyrd Skynyrd, but also hated the idea of the South that, you know, gave birth to. And so Where the Devil Don't Stay, Traveling the South with the Drive-By Truckers is the other book that I'm reading. And those are the two worlds that I'm inhabiting alongside a lot of podcasts, because history is satisfying to me right now.
I'm embarrassed to admit that I had no idea Jason Isbell was in the Drive-By Truckers. I love Jason Isbell. I love the Drive-By Truckers. I had no idea.
So he was in the Truckers. He was 22 years old when he was in the Truckers. Like he literally was 22 when he joined the Truckers, and he got kicked out because of his drinking problem, like maybe 6 years later or something. And he was adrift for a bunch of time after that. He made the 3 solo albums, and then he went into rehab and came out and made Southeastern, which became the giant album that it is now. So it's like, it takes such a long time for people to cook that I think it's like sometimes something that I totally forget, you know, like he can be in a band like the Truckers, get out, make 3 records and have all of those not really say too much. And then eventually you get to something as monumental and towering as Southeastern.
Sorry,
you want to talk some more Jason Isbell? We could do this for like an hour, man. I'm chill with that.
Real niche in a hurry. I don't know what I was expecting, but
yes.
Okay. So before we close, Carolyn Smart says she is disappointed that you did not talk a bit about Liverpool FC. I'm going to go ahead and just like put a veto on that to be Jason Isbell. At least I know something about. We're not doing football.
We're not doing football. Hey, listen, you can a little bit. No, I don't know.
I grew up in the Middle East where there was nothing but football, and I was garbage at football. There was more than one season in high school where I scored more own goals than regular goals. I hate football. I don't use that word lightly. If you want to say something about Liverpool FC, feel free, but I will mute you after 30 seconds.
I mean, I'll tell you this, that I think like one of the most satisfying essays to write in the book was the essay about Mohammed Salah and Liverpool. And it's really an essay about my relationship to Islam and what it feels like to watch someone like Salah be the biggest footballer on the planet and have like young white men sort of worship him and sing songs that are like, you know, if he scores another few, then I'll be Muslim too. And I'm like, do you know what that means? Like, do you understand the consequences of you committing to be Muslim too because your favorite football player is Muslim too? And so Liverpool is absolutely has a place in the book. And also, we're having a hell of a season. I can't believe that you don't want to talk about that, but I will leave it there. We're going to win. I'm going to call this now. I know we're second. I know that there's a gap, but I think we can clear it. I think we're good.
I cannot begin to explain to you how little I care about what but I will say that it is the highest compliment I can pay, that despite my hatred of everything football, I did adore that chapter and this book. We almost got through one of these without me talking about Carolyn Smart. And then that went off the rails because if you enjoyed any of these talks, if you enjoyed anything that happened in this residency, please know that it is entirely the doing of Carolyn Smart. None of this would have happened without her. Also, just my books and my career in general. So one last thank you to Carolyn before we close this off. She is responsible for so much of this. Thank you for doing this, ELAMIN. I appreciate it. I know that your schedule is going to fill right the hell up, and it's going to be one hell of a year for you. I will say that I have an editor named Jared Bland. When he gets excited about a book and tells me about it, it immediately goes to the top of my reading pile. And that was the case more than a year ago when he says we have this memoir coming out. It is fantastic. The sun is starting to come out of the clouds in Portland, so I'm gonna be bathed in light as I give this one last recommendation to pick up this book. As of late, I get asked to blurb a lot of books, not because anybody cares what I have to say, but because I won the Giller and they want to put Giller Prize winning whatever. I've read a lot of really good books recently. I've had a string of good luck on that front. I have not read a piece of nonfiction that has hit me as hard as this book. Maybe I'm biased because of my personal experience, but I don't think I am. I think you're going to be hearing a lot about Son of Elsewhere in the next little while, and deservedly so. It's an incredible piece of work. This concludes whatever this series was of these conversations. Thank you so much to everyone who came out to this. Thank you, Sam, Jessica, Megan, for making this happen under weird circumstances. This was all supposed to be in person. Obviously, that went sideways at the last minute, but it's been so much fun. Please feel free to reach out. I'm not hard to reach. And thank you again, everyone. This was a real pleasure.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks for having me.
Woo!